Now, I wanted to tailor the first few installments of this show to those who know nothing about me and nothing about what it is that I do. Maybe someone you know encouraged you to listen in, and you're not sure what to expect. You may be wondering, who is this guy? Why should I believe him? Why should I trust him? As it happens, for this show, it doesn't matter if you know anything about me, and it doesn't matter whether you trust me or believe me, because this show is very different from almost anything else you'll hear. There are plenty of political talk shows out there which make conflicting claims and argue about the facts, and you can never tell who's mistaken or even who's lying. Mostly, the discussion consists of some guy saying, your party is stupid and evil and my party is wise and good. And someone on the other side saying the opposite. No, my noble, brave candidate will save the world, and your nasty, corrupt candidate will cause pain and suffering. And so that pointless bickering goes on and on ad infinitum and doesn't change anybody's mind. That is not what this show is about. That is not a discussion you'll hear on this show. Let me start by saying this. I'm going to assume that anyone listening to this show, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, liberal, moderate, progressive, conservative, constitutionalist, I really don't care. I'm going to assume that anyone listening to this show wants truth and justice to prevail, wants the innocent protected and the guilty stopped. Now, there can be a lot of conflicting ideas of who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, and what justice looks like, and so on. But I'm going to start with the assumption that you, the listener, want what is best for humanity. Because if you don't, if you're someone who delights in the pain and suffering of others, then I don't really care what you think, and you're not going to care what I think either. What I have to say is for people who want to be good, who want to do the right thing. Again, there are a lot of different opinions about what the right thing is, but that's where this show will likely be different from anything you've heard before. Because on this show, unlike just about anywhere else, the main focus is not going to be me throwing my own moral beliefs at you, trying to bludgeon you into agreeing with me. That never works anyway. Instead, aside from my beliefs, independent of my own beliefs and values, I want to take you through some ideas to test whether your beliefs and values are consistent with themselves. Now, that may sound a little strange, because just about everyone of every religious, political, or philosophical position will say, well, I already know what I think, and I already know that I'm right, and I know that I'm consistent and principled in what I think. I mean, can you imagine anyone saying otherwise? Can you imagine someone saying, no, what I think is stupid and self-contradictory and makes no sense? No, each person, including you, thinks he already has a pretty good grip on things. And actually, that's one of the main problems. Everyone thinks he already understands reality. He already knows right from wrong. Even the terrorist who goes around blowing up innocent people, he really and truly believes that he's in the right, or he wouldn't do it. Same with the fascist thugs of some tyrannical regime, or some psychotic mass murderer who kills and eats his neighbors. Whatever people do seems reasonable and proper to them at the time, or they wouldn't do it. Based on the way they see the world, based on their beliefs and their perceptions, they act the way they do. And to them, it makes sense. No one thinks that he is the bad guy. Now, I'm not pushing moral relativism here. I'm not saying that everyone is equally right and equally moral. They're not. I'm saying that the main problem is usually one of perceptions, not intentions. Lots of horribly nasty things have been done in the name of good intentions by people who, at least to begin with, actually meant well. And the problem has almost always been a lack of understanding of reality, not understanding what's actually going on. So, here's my challenge to you. I'm not questioning your motives. I'm not alleging that you're a bad, evil person. Again, if you are, you're not going to care what I think. I'm not going to care what you think. Instead, assuming you're a basically good person, trying to do the right thing, I want to challenge you to re-examine some of your beliefs and assumptions. In short, I want you to take an honest look at your own perceptions and actions, especially as they relate to politics and government, and see if you might be doing things, however inadvertently, that are destructive to humanity and society. Because, to be blunt, you are. Now, I don't think you're trying to, but I believe that you are most likely contributing to suffering and injustice in the world. Now, why the heck would I say such a thing about you when I know nothing about you? I don't know who's listening. I say that because almost everyone is. Almost everyone, by way of their belief system, again, as it relates to politics and government, is contributing to the pain and suffering of mankind. Now, again, I don't care what you think of my opinions and beliefs, so if you're feeling defensive because I said that, don't bother. Who cares what I think? But here's what is important. Are you capable of objectively and honestly examining your own belief systems to see if you might accidentally be advocating something destructive? Unfortunately, very few people are capable of that kind of self-examination. Most people would literally rather kill or die than reconsider the assumptions they've always made, the beliefs they've always held, the ideas that they were brought up in. So, does truth and justice matter enough to you that you dare to examine your own beliefs and behaviors? After all, if you're already right about things, if you're already advocating what you should be advocating, what would it hurt to double check? You'll just be more sure of it. By analogy, if you're doing a math problem and you think you already have the right answer, what's the harm in double checking your work? You might find that you made a mistake. Or you might find that you didn't and you were right the first time. But if you don't dare to reconsider, if you don't dare to take another look at your beliefs, maybe it's because you suspect that you're wrong. Deep down inside, you think you might be wrong, and maybe you don't really want to know that if you are. And that is the ultimate act of cowardice, to close your eyes to the truth because it might be uncomfortable. So the question comes down to this. Are you willing to re-examine some of your most fundamental beliefs if it might reduce the pain and suffering of others? Or do you just want to shut your eyes, shut your ears, and cling to whatever you already believe, regardless of whether you're hurting others? If you have the spine, if you're brave enough, stay right where you are, and after this break, we'll get right into it. Oh, and if you're a liberal and you're thinking, he won't ever make me into a conservative, or you're a conservative and you're thinking, he'll never make me into a liberal, either way, you're right. I won't make anyone into either one of those, nor would I ever want to. Because the truth, as uncomfortable as it might be, leads in a very different direction. We'll be right back. If you missed the first segment, I basically dared the listener, whatever his religious, political, or philosophical position might be, to let me take him through a process of re-examination so that you, the listener, could see whether there might be inconsistencies and contradictions in your own beliefs, perceptions, and actions. Again, I'm assuming that you're a good person trying to do the right thing. And I'm not asking you to throw away your values and take mine instead. I just want you to take a look at your own values and see if you see anything amiss in there. See if you might, by accident, be doing something destructive. Let me start with a simple, slightly silly example of what I mean. Suppose that you were raised to respect other people, do unto others, love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, live and let live, all that good stuff. But for some reason, you grew up in a culture where, despite all those good teachings, there was this other thing going on, that whenever someone was spotted wearing a purple hat, everyone else would viciously, physically assault the guy, beating him almost to death. Now, growing up, you saw this happening over and over again, and never got an explanation of why, but you grew to expect it. and grew to assume that it must be necessary and proper. There must be some reason for it. So when you were old enough, whenever you saw someone wearing a purple hat, you'd go enthusiastically join in beating the heck out of the guy. Now, it would be pretty easy to demonstrate that there's a big contradiction between believing in love your neighbor and live and let live and all that, and thinking it's okay to brutally assault someone for wearing a purple hat. There's an obvious mental conflict and contradiction there. And if someone helped you to see it, you might figure out that, yeah, despite tradition and what everyone around you was doing, it's really not okay to beat someone up for wearing a purple hat. And that doing so is not in keeping with what you otherwise believe. Yes, I know it's a silly example, but keep that in mind. Because that's basically all I want to try to do on this show. I want to show you that, in all likelihood, you are doing things akin to beating up people with purple hats. You're doing things just as absurd and, in fact, far more destructive simply because your upbringing and your culture and your belief system have led you to believe that it's okay, that it's good to do such things. And if you've never heard anyone question it, which few people ever have, you'd never have much reason to doubt it. So, let's start with a very common, simple, real-world example. Suppose you live in a little town and you have a couple kids and you want to send them to school. And private school there is too expensive for you at the moment. So you send them to the local public school instead. Now, you know that that school is funded by local property taxes. And you pay your property taxes, but your few $1,000s a year isn't enough by itself to cover the costs of educating your two kids. But then, you're not the only one paying property taxes. Everyone who owns property in the town does. Now, suppose you have neighbors who never had kids, so they don't actually need the services of any school. But they get a bill for property taxes just like you do. In short, they're being made to pay for something that directly benefits you, but not them. Now, just so we're clear, we all know what happens if they don't pay. If those neighbors who never had kids of their own, if they don't pay their property taxes that fund the school, the local township or borough or whatever it is will start sending them nasty letters, demanding money and adding on penalties and interest and that sort of thing. And eventually will tell your neighbors, look, you're going to pay up or we're going to take your house from you and sell it to pay your back taxes. So let's be clear about the situation. This is not about someone going around the neighborhood collecting donations and contributions or asking people to voluntarily chip in for the local school. This is the local government demanding money from all property owners and backing that demand with the threat of forcibly kicking anyone who doesn't pay off his own property. Of course, most people pay and it never gets to that point. But the reality is, your neighbor's only choices are pay up or have his property taken from him, eventually. The politicians might speak of it as contributions, but everyone involved knows that it's not voluntary. They're not just asking nicely. They're saying, you will give us this much money every year, or we will eventually send men with guns to take your property from you by force. So, there you are with a couple kids in public school, paid for in part by your neighbor, who is forced to help pay for you to get that benefit. Oh well, that's the way it is. That's how the system works. Now, here's a different question. Suppose there were no property taxes, and there was no public school in your town. There was a private school, but it cost pretty much. So you went to your neighbor yourself, the same neighbors, the ones who had no kids, and said, look, I can't afford the cost of sending my two kids to school, so you, Mr. Neighbor, are going to give me $3,000, and then I can afford it. And your neighbor says, well, things are pretty tight for us right now. We might be able to donate a couple $100s to help out, but we don't have a few thousand. And you respond to your neighbor, you don't understand. I wasn't asking you. I was telling you, you will give me $3,000, or eventually I'll send men with guns to chase you off your property so I can sell it and use it to pay for my kids' schooling. Okay, would doing that be in line with your personal ethics and values? Do you think it would be okay for you to do that to your neighbors? Do you think demanding money from your neighbor and threatening with violence if he refuses would be a moral, justifiable thing for you to do? I'm guessing no. I'm guessing you don't think that would be okay. You know that would be wrong. You don't need me to tell you that. And you would feel completely unjustified in doing anything like that. Okay, here comes a question you will never hear asked in the mainstream media or on any quote-unquote normal talk show. If it's bad for you to do that, if it would be immoral theft if you did that to your neighbor, why is it okay for you to expect and allow and ask that the exact same thing be done to your neighbor by the local government? Why is that okay and good? What's the excuse? Well, it's necessary. That's just how things are. Oh, like beating up people who wear purple hats? It's okay because that's the system? Because we've always done it? It's okay because everyone else does it? What exactly makes it okay? If robbing people is bad, thou shalt not steal and all that, if threatening innocent people is bad, if assaulting nonviolent neighbors and kicking them off their own property if they don't give you money to pay for things you want, if that's bad, how does changing the name of that action and calling it property taxes make it into something good and noble and righteous? Either way, your neighbor is being forced to hand over money for something you want and he doesn't. Why would it make any difference morally whether you do it to him yourself or whether someone else does it to him on your behalf? Okay, freeze your brain, because this is where most people, as a result of cognitive dissonance, start having emotional fits, because their own moral code drastically clashes with what's happening around them and what they're advocating. And they don't question it. They don't even notice it. So take a deep breath, relax, be calm, think rationally. If there's a rational answer to this question, we can find it without tantrums and getting emotional. If there's not a rational explanation for this, if there really is that big a glaring contradiction in your belief system, in your own belief system, maybe you need to change something inside your own head. Mull that point over, and we'll be right back after this break. To recap, our example was that if you wouldn't feel morally justified in threatening your neighbor to coerce him into helping pay for your kid's education, why would you support someone else doing the same thing in the name of property taxes and public schools? Now, at this point, it's very important to look at the difference between actual things and terminology. Giving something a different name doesn't change what it is. If you call an alligator a bunny rabbit, it's still an alligator. If you call a murderer a kind and loving helper. Let's go back for a minute to the silly example of a culture in which it's commonly accepted that it's okay to physically assault anyone who wears a purple hat. If you call wearing a purple hat a crime and call beating up the guy who wears the purple hat law enforcement, it would still be just as bad. It would still be wrong. What you call something makes no difference to what it is. But it can make a huge difference in what you imagine it to be. As unlikely as this may seem, deceptive, inaccurate terminology can and does drastically warp your very perception of the world around you. Now, let's return to our example of forcing your neighbor, the neighbor who has no kids, to help pay for your kids to go to school. If you called such a demand a tax, if you were doing it yourself and you said, I'm going to call this a tax instead of just a threat, would it change what it actually was? Would a change in the words you use change the morality of the event? If you called your threat a law and called it a crime if he didn't hand over his money, would that make your robbery of him into a good and moral thing? No. It's absurd to think that changing the words you use to describe something changes the actual nature of the thing. You can call threats and extortion taxes and laws and bunny rabbits and purple hats. You can call it whatever you want. It's still what it is. And whether it's justified and legitimate or not, whether it's good or it's bad, doesn't depend at all upon what you call it. So let's back up, slow down, and see if we can come up with any reasonable explanation for why it would be bad for you to rob your neighbor personally, but it's good for those who call themselves the local government to do the same thing for you. Again, the terminology makes no difference. What's actually happening? You know that if you did it, that would be wrong. So setting aside euphemisms and rhetoric, is there anything that can make it right for the same thing to be done to your neighbor by way of property taxes and public schools? You'll often hear the refrain that, well, taxes are necessary, and that's the system we have, and we need government doing things for the common good and making everyone pay for certain things, and even if some people don't want to, and even if some people have no use for the things, they're paying for things they don't want and don't benefit from. So is it just necessity that makes it okay? Well, if it's supposedly necessary for there to be taxes to have these public schools, if that end justifies that means, then why does it matter who does it? If necessity makes that okay, why wouldn't it make it okay for you to go do it yourself, to go rob your neighbor yourself without any law or tax on your side? So it isn't just that it's necessary. Now, why is it that it would be bad for you to do something but okay for someone else to do it? If we accept the notion of human equality, how can morality apply differently to different people? Can elections and appointments and legislation actually bestow upon certain people the right to do certain things that you don't have the right to do yourself? That's certainly what we're all taught. We're all taught that when government imposes, for example, a property tax to fund a school, in other words, when they issue a formal demand insisting that all local property owners send the money or risk having their property forcibly taken from them, we're taught that that's legitimate and righteous. But if you did the exact same thing yourself, you know that would be immoral. So how did that come about? What on earth could make it so that if two people do the exact same thing, one of them is good and one of them is bad? Again, watch out for the difference between reality and terminology. There are lots of terms that come up in discussions like this. The common good and representative government and paying one's fair share for the good of society and yada, yada, yada. But don't lose sight of what we're literally talking about just because it's being described in certain terms. Drop the rhetoric and euphemisms and describe things in plain, literally accurate terms. And everyone knows the reality of what happens in this situation, even if they don't usually speak of it this bluntly. What happens, one group of people, calling itself government, demands money from lots of other people and under threat of eventually sending armed enforcers after anyone who doesn't pay up. Now, you may not like to hear it described that way, but you know that that is the reality of the situation. You know that would happen to you if you didn't pay. You know that happens to anybody who gets caught not paying. So how can that be okay? Well, we're told that because those in government are elected, they are selected by a majority, therefore they represent us and they have the power to do things on behalf of the people as a whole. And okay, which part of that makes extortion into a moral and righteous act? Is it because they're elected? If someone is elected to office, does that give him an exemption from morality? If an elected official went around murdering people, would that be okay because, hey, he's elected? No, you know that wouldn't make it okay. Incidentally, Hitler got into power by being elected, and I trust you don't think that made what he did okay. So being elected by itself doesn't magically alter morality, doesn't make bad into good. What about passing laws? When a demand is enacted by way of formal legislation, Is that what makes it legitimate and proper? Well, if murder were officially legalized, would it become a good thing? No. Again, to use the cliche example, almost all of what the Nazis did, they formally enacted into law first. And I'm hoping that you don't think that made what they did okay. So sticking the label of law onto something evil doesn't make it into something good. Well, how about numbers? If a majority voted for something, does that make it good? Well, if a majority happened to be of one race and they voted to exterminate a minority race, would that be a good thing? Of course not. Even if 99% of some countries supported something evil, it would still be evil. Majority opinion can't make something bad into something good. So what else is there? Why is it bad for you to steal from your neighbor yourself to pay for your kid's education, but good for those in the local government to do the same thing? Now, I want to intentionally leave that question hanging for now. But in all sincerity, I beg you to carefully think about that question. And it's easy to spout back phrases you learned in civics class about fair share and common good and so on. But I'm asking you to actually think instead of just regurgitating someone else's rhetoric. And here's why it matters. If you're someone who supports the idea of tax-funded public schools, just as one example, if you accept that as legitimate, I dare you to look closely at what it is that you are personally advocating. I dare you to objectively examine the idea to see whether it coincides with your own values and your own moral code. Do you believe what you believe? Do you condone what you condone? Are you doing what you do because it actually matches your basic understanding of right and wrong, or just because that's how things are and how you assume they must be? Are you doing destructive things just because it's familiar, it's accepted, it's what's done, it's what everyone else does? Now, this is one example of hundreds I could have used, and we'll get into the more general principles later. But this is a simple example that everyone can relate to. Is it okay with you if your children's education is funded in part by people who have no kids being forced to fund something they don't personally have any use for? Is that okay with you? Does that jive with your standards of right and wrong? I'm not asking if it jives with my moral code. Who cares? I'm asking if you're being consistent with your own values, if you're being loyal to your own sense of morality. Think about it. Now, if you're like most people, you've never had anyone ask you anything like this before. And thinking about this might not be comfortable. But if you want to be sure that you are not personally contributing to strife and conflict and injustice in the world, this is the sort of uncomfortable self-re-examination you need to do. So think about it. After this break, in the last segment of tonight's show, we'll completely shift gears, and I'll give you one more thing to ponder until next week. We'll be right back. I have a question for any Republican or Democrat voter. These days, stretching back for a long time in fact, it seems that the way most people vote is not so much because they're just thrilled about what one party is doing, but because they're scared to death of what the other party is trying to do. So, picture in your mind that other party, the one you vote against, and see if you can sum up what it is about that party that you find so distasteful, that makes you so determined to keep them out of power. Might it go something like this? The politicians in their party, they pretend to be serving the people, and they pretend to care about the country, but they're really all just liars and crooks out for their own power. You can see that, and you don't know why the people who vote for them can't. And their policies, the things they try to pass into law, they're all about trying to control your choices, trying to make you serve their priorities instead of your own, trying to foist their values on you, and you don't like that. They claim that what they advocate is for the common good, but you know that their agenda is destructive and dangerous to society. And they want to force you to fund their agenda, to pay for things you're morally opposed to. They think it's their business to meddle in your choices of how to run your own life and to make you financially support things that you're strongly against. You're scared of them having power because their misguided, if not malicious, agenda is ruining the country. Does that pretty much sum it up? Okay, now I want you to see if you can sum up why the people who vote for that other party are so determined to keep your party out of power. I'm not asking you if their complaint is valid. Obviously, you think it's not. I'm just asking you to see if you can put into words why, from their perspective, they're against your party being in power. Might it go something like this? They think that the politicians in your party, while pretending to be serving the people and pretending to care about the country, are really all a bunch of liars and crooks out for their own power. And they don't know why you can't see that. The policies of your party, the things your party is trying to pass into law, they think they're all about trying to control the choices of your political opponents, trying to make them serve your priorities instead of their own, trying to foist your values on them, and they don't like it. As they see it, you claim that what you advocate is for the common good, but they think that your agenda is destructive and dangerous to society. And they think you're trying to force them to fund your agenda, to pay for things that they're morally opposed to. As they see it, you think it's your business to meddle in their choices of how to run their own lives and to make them financially support things that they're strongly against. They're scared of your party having power because they think that the misguided, if not malicious agenda of your party is ruining the country. Does that about sum up their position of your party? Does that sound a little bit familiar? Now, don't bother going into a rant about why you're right and they're wrong, because that's not the point here. The point is, you are both scared of the politicians of the other party getting into power because you don't want them controlling your choices, making you serve their priorities instead of your own, using your tax dollars for things you think are destructive or immoral, forcing you to support their agenda. Now, if you both see it that way, is there any way to reconcile this? They don't want to be forced to serve your agenda. You don't want to be forced to serve their agenda. Are you just going to clunk heads for the rest of your lives? Now, here's an uncomfortable question. Whatever you think of their values and priorities, are they right when they claim that you're trying to force your will on them, trying to force them to bend to your values and priorities? Well, do you vote for people who you know are going to tax them to pay for things they don't want? Now, you can argue about why they should want those things, why they should have the same values and priorities as you, but you know they don't. And you know the people you vote for would use the law to force them to make choices you like, but they don't like. You know that if your guy wins, they will be taxed to fund things that you are for and they're against. Again, you can pontificate about why it is that what they're for is stupid and evil and what you're for is wise and good, but that's not the point. The question is, do you think it's okay for you to try to put people into power, put people into office who you know are going to use the force of government to impose your choices upon those other people, choices they don't like, and are going to make them fund things you want but that they don't? Do you think it's okay for you to advocate doing that to them? And I bet you don't think it's okay when they advocate doing the same thing in the other direction to you. Oh, but what you want is good and righteous and necessary and conducive to a peaceful and just society, and what they want is bad and unjust and stupid and destructive. Yeah, and they think the exact same thing in the other direction. Pick some government endeavor that you support and think is important, whether it's military or the police or taking care of the poor or more funding for public schools, whatever it is, whatever program you support, you know that there are people out there who, for whatever reason, even if it's just because they're misguided or ignorant, They don't like how that government operation is run, and they don't like being forced to pay for it. Well, if you believe in live and let live, or do unto others as you would have done unto you, do you really think it's okay for you to advocate that they be forced to fund things they don't like? And don't say that that's just how things are and that's how the system works, because that's not the question. The question is whether what you are personally advocating by way of how you vote is in line with your own moral code. And yes, they're trying to do the same thing to you when they vote for the other guy. Why is it bad when they do it and good when you do it? Because you know better than them? Does that make it okay to use government to control their choices and make them fund whatever you think is important? Even if you're right about what matters and what's important, do you consider it moral, righteous, and civilized to use the force of law to coerce others into making whatever choices you think they should make, to force them to fund things you think they should fund? Is that in keeping with your own moral code? Now, I realize that when it comes to politics, almost everyone has an us against them mentality. It's like a football game. People cheer for one side or the other. If you win, I lose. If you lose, I win. That's the mentality. It's a combat. It's a conflict of interest. All most people see is a choice between red or blue. Either you're on my side or you're the enemy when it comes to politics. And this often gets in the way of people's ability to think rationally. For example, if I call into question what someone is supporting and advocating by way of the political party or agenda they're pushing for, they often respond to me by saying, "Oh, so you're one of those people who support that other party." No, I'm not. But if they think that the only possible choices are A or B, and I point out a problem in supporting A, maybe it's not a good thing, they jump to the conclusion that I must be advocating B, because they can't think of another alternative. I'm not advocating A. I'm not advocating B. I'm advocating something far more basic than that. I'm advocating that people take the time and put in the effort to honestly examine their own beliefs and their own actions to see if they measure up to their own sense of right and wrong. Not mine. Why would you care whether I think you're doing the right thing? But I hope it would matter to you whether you're behaving in a way that is consistent with your own morality, your own sense of right and wrong. Now, if it makes you feel better, I don't mind saying that the people who support that other party, the party you're against, they're not acting in accordance with their own moral codes and their own sense of right and wrong. The bad news is, neither are you. Now, before you get mad at me for saying that, let me again emphasize that I'm not saying that your basic values and priorities are bad. I'm not saying that you're trying to be bad or that you don't care what is right and wrong. Quite the opposite. The only reason I'm bothering to say any of this is because I'm assuming that you do care about right and wrong. You are trying to do the right thing. You do want to be a good person. What I'm suggesting is that when it comes to politics and government, you and just about everyone else have been taught things that are drastically distorting your perceptions of reality in a way that leads you to do things and support things and advocate things that you would otherwise recognize as immoral and destructive. And if that's the case, then pointing your finger at those other people doing the same thing and saying, well, they're even worse, that doesn't really fix anything. Yes, there are people worse than you in the world. Is that a good reason to not examine your own beliefs and behaviors? Is your goal to do the right thing or just to do something not quite as bad as what the guy next to you is doing? Your beliefs were not your choice. You didn't come up with them on your own. You were trained into them by teachers and parents and the society around you. Don't be afraid to question those beliefs that aren't really yours. They were stuck into your head by other people. Greetings and welcome to the second episode of Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rose. Now, what we discuss here relates to political philosophy, but this show is pretty much the antithesis of just about every other political talk show out there. You could say this is the anti-political talk show. There's certainly no shortage of shows on which political advocates vehemently pontificate at great length about why their political party or their political agenda is the road to salvation, and that the other party is the road to doom and gloom. Talking heads of all political stripes preach this, trying to impress on you that you should join their club, be on their team. And if you don't bow to whatever political gods they want you to worship, Republican, Democrat, whatever, they will condemn you as being not only gullible and stupid, but possibly also malicious and evil. So they implore you to throw your support in votes and dollars behind the would-be saviors that they offer. Vote for us, put us into power, and we'll protect you. We'll take care of you. We'll save the world. That is the message of all political parties and all of the pundits and talking heads who support them. That's the message they're always trying to sell. Salvation via politics. Well, on this show, Outside the Cage, the goal is not to convince you to empower any politician or any political party. Quite the opposite. The goal here is to help you empower yourself by helping you to escape the rhetoric and the propaganda from all political parties that is designed to deceive you into betraying your own judgment, into forsaking your own values, and into giving up the power that is rightfully yours to a bunch of political con men, be they Republican, Democrat, whatever. It doesn't much matter which so-called leaders you decide to sacrifice your free will to. Either way, you are betraying humanity by allowing your creativity and productivity, your goodness, to become fuel for the agendas of some of the most power-happy evil people in the world. If that sounds a little too heavy for you, let me say this. I'm not here to make you change your moral compass or your sense of right and wrong. My only goal here is to help you to be true to your own sense of right and wrong by showing you how almost all of the rhetoric you hear about government and politics is drastically warping your perceptions and thereby your behavior in a way that not only goes against your own interests, but against the interests of mankind as a whole. My goal is to help you not have your values and morals corrupted and perverted by the common political mythology. Unlike every politician out there, the last thing in the world I want is for you to substitute my will for yours, to replace your judgment and your values with mine. I'm not here to see if I can control you in mind or in body, or try to bend you to my will, or trick you into doing my bidding. On the contrary, my goal here is only to remove from you the puppet strings which others are using to control you, confine you, restrain you, and subjugate you, mentally even more so than physically. Unlike every political party in history, I'm not offering you a better cage, or a bigger cage, or a more comfortable cage, or a cage with more toys in it. I'm offering you only an open door, a way out of the cage. If you dare to walk out that door and reclaim complete ownership and control of yourself, then I'll be finished. My goal is not to free you so you will serve my purposes or be loyal to me. My goal is to show you the cage that you are in and show you the way out of it so you can serve your own purposes and be loyal to your own values and priorities, to have your life, your time and energy go to the things that you want done, that you think are important. Okay, now, here is the paradigm we all grew up in. There's this thing called government, and it passes laws, imposes taxes, and spends money on things, presumably for the common good. Now, just about everybody knows that government tends to be corrupt and inefficient and wasteful and sometimes downright oppressive and destructive. But the theory is that because we can vote, we the people have the power to fix such problems. In a nutshell, here's how the game called democracy works. We, the people, bicker amongst ourselves about what we want government to do. One group might want tons of funding for the military and not so much for welfare benefits. Another group wants it the other way around, less military, more social programs. This group wants tougher immigration laws. This group wants government controlling these things, but not those things over there. Another group wants it the other way around, laws about this stuff, but leaving individuals in freedom when it comes to those things. When you step into a voting booth, you get to choose which political agenda you want imposed via law enforcement upon the people of the country. Do you want to tax them for more police or for more medical benefits? Do you want government to ban drugs or ban guns? Which behaviors do you want regulated? Which choices do you want the politicians to control? Inside the voting booth, voting for a government that does nothing isn't an option. You won't find any candidate running for office who will say, if you vote for me, I won't tax anyone or anything. I won't spend any money on anything, and I won't tell anyone what to do. People don't run for office. They don't strive to get a hold of the reins of power in order to do nothing with it. And if anyone did, he wouldn't get any votes. People vote because they want their priorities and agendas, their values and beliefs to become, quote-unquote, public policy. That's the game we all grew up in. Fight over who gets to be on the throne and try to get someone up there who will do what you want, will fund the things that you like, will enact laws that you think are a good idea. Democracy is often described in more vague, pleasant-sounding terms, but everyone knows that the reality is it's a battle between all sorts of different groups trying to get their ideas legislated, thereby forcing their ideas on everyone else. And whoever wins, it's called the will of the people. Though, obviously, it's not the will of all the people, because every election, lots and lots of voters lose. They don't get their way. And then for a few years, they get to be subjected to the agenda and ideas of the other people, the ones who won. And in a few years, the game starts all over again. That's the game of democracy. We're taught that not only is all of that legitimate and good, but that this game, democracy, is what makes us free and makes us civilized and shows how wise and advanced and progressive we are. Well, when we come back after this break, we're going to take a look at whether this game called democracy actually fits with your own sense of right and wrong, your own moral code, and whether playing the game of voting is conducive or destructive to the kind of world you want to live in. This is Larken Rose. You're listening to Outside the Cage, and we will be right back. Welcome back to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rose. So, it's time to take a look at this game called democracy to see if it's something that helps or hinders your values and priorities and your sense of right and wrong. Because as I've said before, I'm not here to try to foist my agenda and priorities or my values and morals upon you. I'm here to show you that by way of the rhetoric relating to politics and government, you are being tricked into betraying your own values and priorities. So, let's see how this democracy thing matches up to the kind of world you want to live in. And I'm not going to be telling you anything about democracy that you don't already know, but you'll never hear it spoken of this literally or bluntly in the mainstream media. We're going to do this in 3 parts. First, we'll see what you are doing to others when you vote. Then we'll see what others are doing to you when they vote. And finally, we'll take a look at what someone else is doing to both of you and the guy who votes for the other party. But let's start with what you are doing to others when you vote. We got into this a bit on last week's show. For example, pick something you want the government doing, whether it's the military or some welfare program or whatever. Whatever it is, you know there are other people who, for whatever reason, don't want to pay for that, or at least don't want to give it as much funding as you want it to have. Well, when you vote, you're trying to put people into office that you know are going to force those other people to fund those things that they don't want, even things they're morally opposed to. Again, the question is doing so in keeping with your sense of morality and how you think you should treat other people? Do you think it's okay to force them to spend their money on whatever you think is important instead of on what they think is important? Again, you can argue for why they should have the same priorities and values as you, and you might even be right. But in your daily life, you don't go around committing armed robbery just so you can spend other people's money the way you think they should spend it. You know that would be wrong. So why would you imagine it to be right when you vote for someone else to do the same thing for you? If it's bad for you to force your neighbor to fund what you think is important, why is it okay to ask someone else to force the same neighbor to hand over the same money to fund the same things, the things you support, but he doesn't? Does putting the label of law on that and calling it democracy make it okay? And of course, the politicians don't just tax and spend. They also enact lots and lots of other laws telling people how to behave, telling them what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, and what they must do. Again, there's an aspect of this that everybody knows, but which is hardly ever mentioned in the mainstream media. If you support a certain law and it gets enacted, what happens to those who are caught disobeying? You already know the answer. It's no big secret. People caught breaking the law are fined or imprisoned, which means that some of their money is taken or they're put in a cage. Now, there are some cases when that would probably be perfectly in keeping with your moral code. If someone is running around murdering people, for example, I believe, and I'm guessing that you believe, that it's a good thing for other people to stop them, to forcibly capture that person, to stop him from committing any more murder. And so supporting laws against murder and wanting a group of people trained and authorized to stop murderers is in line with your own values and morals. Now, you might not have the ability or the courage to try to chase down a murderer yourself, but I bet you'd feel justified in doing so, in using force to stop him, if you did have the ability. So it makes perfect sense for you to support other people doing that. But there are literally thousands of laws that don't fit this mold. Laws about things you would not feel justified in enforcing against your neighbors on your own. Of the zillions of examples I could use, let's focus for a minute on two common examples. One usually supported by conservatives, one usually supported by liberals. The Republican Party has long been a proponent of the war on drugs, whereby the possession of various mind-altering substances is outlawed. And the Democratic Party has long been pushing for gun control, whereby the possession of various weapons is outlawed. Now, whenever such laws are passed, what happens to offenders who get caught? If someone gets caught with an illegal drug or an illegal weapon, even if that person didn't threaten or harm anyone, what happens to that person? You already know the answer. But again, I like to bypass rhetoric and euphemisms and speak in blunt, literally accurate terms. What happens is that the person possessing the quote-unquote illegal thing is forcibly captured by men with guns and put in a cage for a while, sometimes for years. Everybody knows this, even if they don't usually describe it that way. And as we mentioned on last week's show, the terms you use to describe something don't change what it is. But people like to phrase things in a certain way so they can feel better about what they believe, what they advocate, and what they do. Let me illustrate the point using the examples of the war on drugs and gun control. Let's make it into a psychological exercise while we're at it. If you're for gun control, say the following out loud. I support gun control. That was easy, wasn't it? Now, using more specific terms, which you know are literally accurate, say the exact same thing but in a different way. It would go like this. I support men with guns forcibly capturing and caging anyone caught possessing certain weapons, even if the person hasn't threatened or harmed anyone. Now, saying that isn't as comfortable, is it? Is there any part of that that's literally inaccurate? No. You already knew what all gun control actually implies. Physically capturing and locking up people who are caught possessing certain things. Okay, now we don't want to leave the Republicans out, so let's do the equivalent on that side. If you support drug prohibition, say the following out loud. I support drug prohibition. That's easy enough. How about using more specific terms you know are literally accurate? How about if you say the exact same thing in a different way? It would go something like this. I support men with guns forcibly capturing and caging anyone caught possessing certain mind-altering substances, even if the person hasn't threatened or harmed anyone. Now, I bet putting it that way, it wasn't so fun to say. It's perfectly accurate, as you know. But again, it makes people less comfortable to state the raw reality of it so bluntly. The euphemism, the war on drugs, sounds so much nicer and so much more righteous. Now again, I'm not trying to foist my values onto you. You might think using drugs is a bad idea. You might think having a gun. You might think having a gun is a bad idea. And other people can argue with you that using drugs or having a gun is a good idea. But that's not the point here. In your daily life, you don't drag someone away and put them in a cage every time you see him doing something you think is a bad idea. But when you vote, every single law that your candidate or your party enacts is telling someone somewhere, you will not do this. And if we catch you disobeying us, we'll take some of your money or we'll take you and put you in a cage. Now, that's widely accepted as legitimate and justified when it's done via law. We're all raised to believe that when government issues commands and imposes taxes and things like that it's not bound by the same morality that you and I are bound by. It's imagined to have the right to do things that we don't have the right to do. That is why you don't feel bad asking it to do things to your neighbor that you would never in a million years do to your neighbor on your own, because you would know it would be wrong. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, once said this: no man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck. And after this break, we will see just how true that is. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rose. Now that we've looked at what you are doing to your neighbors when you vote, when you play the game called democracy, that we're all taught is so great and wonderful, let's look at what your neighbors are doing to you when they vote. Now, some of this is obvious, and lots of people already complain about it. If you're a Democrat, you might not be thrilled about the fact that your tax dollars are funding war. If you're a Republican, you might not be thrilled about the fact that you're being taxed to give money to all sorts of people who haven't earned it. No big surprise there. People grumble about having to support things they don't like. But we're taught that that's just how things are, and that democracy is still wonderful, so we should all just put up with it and deal with it. Well, allow me to rub a little salt in your wounds here. Let's start with the liberals. The money you earn, some of it is taken from you and by taxes, and some of what's taken from you is used to buy bullets and bombs, which are used in every war to do things that end up maiming and killing innocent people. In other words, your time and effort, your very lifeblood taken from you via taxes is making that possible. You are supplying the funding that kills innocent people. How do you feel about that? Not too happy? Well, let me talk to the conservatives. The money you earn, some of it is taken from you, and some of that goes to paying people to sit around not working, doing nothing productive, shooting up drugs and having more children out of wedlock so they get a bigger welfare check. Your time and effort, your very lifeblood, is being used to make that happen. The child of a single crackhead mother who grows up in squalor and public housing, doomed to be an uneducated druggie, dependent upon government handouts for the rest of his probably short, miserable life, that condition exists because you are paying for it. It is your time and effort making it possible. So how do you feel about that? Now, I know that whether you're a liberal or a conservative, when I was talking to the other one, you were complaining, maybe out loud, maybe just inside your own head, you were complaining about the stereotype and defending the agenda that you think is virtuous, necessary, and good, whether it's social programs or the military. Well, guess what? I don't care. I don't care what your complaint is, and I don't even care if you're right. Because the point is that whatever political party and agenda you support, there are others who see that agenda as horribly destructive and evil. And you can tell them, no, it's really good and useful. That's not going to sway them any more than it sways you when they tell you that, no, their agenda is good and useful. The result of this is that no matter who wins any election, lots of people are going to be forced to fund things that they think are immoral and destructive. The recent bailouts is an example that lots of people on both sides are upset about. In short, the economy started going downhill, and the politicians decided that they would take money from you via taxes and give many billions of dollars in handouts to giant banks and corporations. But don't worry, the politicians assured you that it was necessary and that it would fix everything, which it didn't. So how happy are you about that? While you were working hard, trying to provide for your family, trying to make ends meet, how did you like knowing that the fruits of your labor, the results of your time and effort, were being swiped from you and given away to millionaires? And incidentally, this was done by Republican and Democrat politicians, so don't bother with the finger pointing in this case. Allow me to rub it in some more. If you're a liberal, how do you like knowing that your hard work is being used to provide the weapons and prisons that are part of the war on drugs, that lock up many thousands of people whose only sin was to smoke a joint? There are actually millions of people in prison because of this. You paid for the prison they're in. What do you think of that? If you're a conservative, how do you like knowing that you're funding the National Endowment for the Arts when it pays for art that is designed to malign and insult Christianity and religion in general? Or if you're a liberal, how do you like knowing that you're helping pay subsidies to the tobacco industry? If you're a conservative, how do you like knowing that you're being forced to fund the leftist indoctrination agenda of the National Education Association? Now, I could go on back and forth for ages for Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, but that's enough for now. There's a reason I'm rubbing this in, and it isn't just to be mean. This is the essence of democracy. One group being forced to fund the ideas and priorities of another group. When you vote, this is the game you play, seeing who can force his values onto the other guy. Now, do you think that's how people should treat each other? Does that jive with how you usually treat other people? Or do you believe that in the context of politics and democracy, it's a good thing to have a never-ending conflict with different factions perpetually trying to forcibly impose their ideas and priorities on each other? Because that's what democracy is. If you think that's okay, if you like the idea of forcing other people to fund things that they view as destructive and immoral, then, oh well, I guess you're just that kind of person. But if you're starting to have doubts about that great and wonderful perpetual war of all against all, known as democracy, well, good. Glad to hear it. But why do we keep playing this game of voting, fighting to see who gets to control who for the next couple years? Well, we've covered the issue of you trying to foist your values on your neighbor and him trying to foist his values on you, but now it's time to look at the other player in the game, the one who is laughing at both of you. What do both major political parties have in common? Well, they both agree that lots and lots and lots of money should be taken from you and all of your neighbors via taxes, and then spent by the politicians. Now, they may bicker about exactly who should be taxed and how much, and they obviously argue about how to spend the money, but they all accept, and they want you to accept, the assumption that government should and must take trillions of dollars from people who earned it. All of the politicians of both major parties agree that you should be forced to hand over a bunch of what you earn for them to spend the way they see fit. Now, you'd think that that would make everyone mad at the politicians, but that is where the game of democracy distracts and deceives the people. You see, as long as the politicians can keep you and your neighbor vehemently arguing over how, quote-unquote, public funds should be spent, with each of you trying for the chance to make the other guy pay for what you want, then neither of you are going to notice how you're being used by the politicians. If you both accept the premise of taxation and public spending as necessary and good, then the politicians can count on the fact that you and your neighbor will forever be at each other's throats, bickering over what your tax dollars should be spent on, instead of considering the radical, extremist, drastic idea that maybe, just maybe, you should spend your money and your neighbor should spend his. Okay, that's not really that drastic and extreme. And would that be in keeping with your moral code? Spending your own money and letting your neighbor spend his? Does that fit well with live and let live? Yep, sure does. Does it fit with do unto others as you would have done unto you? Yep, fits perfectly. So why aren't we doing that? Why are we playing the game of perpetual conflict known as democracy instead? When we come back from this break, we'll find out. Because someone is benefiting from this game. And it's not you, and it's not your neighbor. Stay tuned, and we will be right back. Welcome back to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rose. At the end of the last segment, we considered a drastic, radical concept, What if you spent your money and let your neighbor spend his money? Fits well with live and let live, and with do unto others as you would have done unto you. So why don't we do that? Who is it that's out there constantly telling you that'll never work? Who is it that's telling you and your neighbor that if government didn't take money from both of you and spend it in the name of the common good, that there would be chaos and mayhem? In other words, who is telling you that you should not just live and let live, that you should not do unto others as you would have done unto you, but that instead you should forever be at odds with your neighbor, battling in the voting booth over which of you will be able to force your will and your values and your ideas on the other guy? Who is pushing that message? Well, it's the people you vote for, and the people your neighbor votes for, the people in power. Why? Because if you and your neighbor decide to get along and leave each other in peace, if you and your neighbor decide not to rob each other or boss each other around, even by way of government and politics, then the people in power would have no power. None at all. Every bit of their power to control and extort, every last scrap of that power comes from you playing their game. Here's a thought. Imagine this. What if any given politician could only tax and control the people who voted for him? What if Democrat politicians could only tax Democrat voters? What if Republican politicians could only enforce their laws upon Republican voters? Well, for one thing, then we'd actually have the consent of the governed. For another, there wouldn't be ongoing vicious animosity between parties. Why would there be? Why would I care who you vote for if I don't have to pay for it or abide by your agenda? And why would you care how I voted if you weren't going to be subjected to my values and priorities? We wouldn't be at each other's throats. We'd get along just fine. And wouldn't that be even more democratic than what we have now? So why isn't that the way things work? Well, who would lose out in such a situation? If politicians could only control the actual individuals who voted for them, who would lose out? Power-happy control freaks, also known as politicians. They would lose out. You see, they need you giving them permission by way of your vote to rob and control your neighbor. Obviously, your neighbor isn't going to agree to be forced to fund things he's against any more than you'd agree to be forced to fund things you're against. And if politicians could only take money from those people who actually agreed to it by voting for those politicians, the politicians would have no power at all. They couldn't make anyone do anything or pay for anything. Under such a system, if you didn't like what some candidate was doing with your money or how he was trying to control your choices, all you'd have to do is don't vote for him anymore, and he would have no power over you. Obviously, that's not the case in the system we have now. But under this hypothetical scenario, where politicians can only control the actual people who vote for them, he would have no power over you if you decided not to give him your vote. The same would be true of your neighbor. You and your neighbor would be completely and totally empowered to run your own lives and spend your own time and money on what you care about. And the politicians would essentially be powerless. The politicians depend entirely upon the divide and conquer tactic that the ritual of voting and the game of democracy provides them. They need you to want your neighbor robbed and controlled. And they need your neighbor to want you robbed and controlled. They need to be able to pretend that what they do with their power is the will of the people, that they are controlling and robbing your neighbor on your behalf, that they are representing you when they boss people around and take their money. Because if the politicians just did it on their own, If a few hundred people in Washington just said, hey everyone, give us trillions of dollars and do whatever we say, who would listen to them? Who would obey? Who would pay? Nobody would. And no one would enforce their commands either. Without the illusion of legitimacy that they get from people voting for them, their game would fall apart, and they would be left utterly powerless. And the power would actually be back in the hands of the people. So who is pushing democracy? Tyrants. That's who. Because despite all the lovey-dovey rhetoric, democracy is not about getting along, and it does not empower the people. It empowers those who claim to be speaking and acting on behalf of the people, and who claim the right to rule, the right to threaten, assault, and steal in the name of the common good and the people. And incidentally, if you pick up a history book and look up all those nasty regimes in history, even they always said that what they were doing was for the good of the country and on behalf of the people. It's the excuse tyrants have used forever. Now, in the last few minutes we have tonight, let's bring things back down to the most basic level, back to just you and your neighbor. Let me ask you this. Are you and your neighbor capable of peacefully coexisting? Do you think you could each refrain from assaulting or robbing each other? Even if you're of different religions or from different cultures or have different beliefs and priorities, different lifestyles, different habits, different vices, different tastes in things, different hobbies, even if you're different in dozens of ways, even if both of you can find things about the other to not like, can you still coexist peacefully? I bet you can, and I bet you already do, except when it comes to politics and government. Most people, whether they're Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, or anything else, recognize that it's good to be civil to your neighbor, to respect his property, and to leave him in peace. Most people try to get along, even with people they don't particularly like. Whatever the specifics of your moral code and how you think you should treat other people, you probably believe in and live by the rule of live and let live in your day-to-day life. Why is that? Because you know that that's the right thing to do. That's how good, civilized human beings behave. That's how they treat each other. So why would you abandon that rule in favor of conflict and coercion when it comes to the game of politics? Why would you allow yourself to be talked into advocating that your neighbor be forcibly controlled and extorted? Why would you imagine that inside of a voting booth, that's suddenly okay, that it's suddenly okay to advocate your neighbor being forcibly controlled? Why would you imagine in that voting booth that suddenly that's a perfectly fine way to treat other people? If that isn't how you behave in your day-to-day life, and I'm guessing it's not, why do you think that calling it law and politics would make it okay? Yes, you can have lots and lots of differences between yourself and your neighbors. So you have a beer and your neighbor has a joint. Do you really think that situation requires the intervention of armed mercenaries of the state? Or your neighbor is more concerned with helping the poor and you're more concerned with having protection against murderers and thieves? Does that really mean you can't get along, that you just have to try to force your neighbor to support your priorities by way of taxes, and that he should be trying to force you to support his? So you believe in different gods, or have different views about education, or about anything else. Is that really a good reason to go running to the people in government to try to get them to forcibly butt into the nonviolent choices of your neighbor? In short, why are you making it so dang easy for tyrants to pit you and your neighbor against each other? so that they, the tyrants, can gain power from the conflict. If you want to be free, free to make your own choices, free to run your own life, free to spend your own money, free to support what you want to support with your time and effort, then you must allow your neighbor the same freedom, including the freedom to make choices different from yours, including the freedom to make choices you don't approve of. If you try to use voting and government to control your neighbor, while at the same time expecting to remain free yourself, you're going to be disappointed. Again, as Frederick Douglass put it, no man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck. Amen, Freddie baby. That's about it for tonight. If you really want to better understand how you are being tricked into supporting injustice and into betraying your own moral code, get a copy of my latest book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, which you can get at Amazon.com or at LarkenRose.com. And be back here next week when, with any luck, it won't just be me ranting here by myself. We'll have our first guests here on Outside the Cage. Welcome to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rose. The purpose of this show is to help people escape the mental cage that has been built around them over the course of their lives through rhetoric and propaganda, which has trained them to see good as evil and evil as good. Now, if that sounds like an exaggeration, keep listening. Every once in a while, you hear a case about some guy who gets caught hiring someone to kill his wife. Now, suppose that at trial, the guy admits to having paid a hitman to murder his spouse, but his defense is, hey, I didn't actually try to kill her myself. I just hired someone else to do it. So I didn't really do anything wrong. If you were on the jury, would that defense persuade you? No, me neither. How about if you find out that your neighbor hired a thief to break into your house to steal your stuff on the agreement that they'd split the loot afterwards? If your neighbor's excuse was, hey, you can't blame me, I was never in your house. I just paid the thief to do it and told him where to find your valuables. But I didn't actually do the robbery, so you can't blame me at all. Would that fly with you? No, me neither. One more example. You're walking along and you see a guy with a huge Rottweiler on a chain. The guy unhooks the chain and he points at you and he says to the dog, kill. Now, later, when you get out of the hospital, the guy argues, hey, I didn't bite you. I never touched you. I wasn't anywhere near you. I'm not responsible at all. Again, would that satisfy you? I'm guessing it wouldn't. Now, let's consider the flip side of this slightly silly point, the relevance of which will become apparent shortly. Suppose you come home and you find someone in your house rummaging through your stuff, and he has a sack of valuables he found so far. When you catch him, the thief explains, hey, you can't blame me for this. It wasn't my idea. Your neighbor hired me to take your stuff. So go complain at him. I'm just doing my job. I'm just following orders and doing what I was told. Do you think that would be a good enough excuse? Or you could do the same thing with the hitman, who says that, hey, the killing was somebody else's idea. The fact that I actually committed the murder, that doesn't make me a bad guy, because someone else told me to. Not a good excuse. Now, there is one exception. The dog who is ordered to attack you really isn't to blame because there's no such thing as canine morality. In that case, the guy giving the order to attack, he bears all of the responsibility himself. But in the other cases, and in lots of others you could easily imagine for yourself, it's pretty dang obvious that not only is the guy who actually does something nasty, theft, assault, murder, etc., not only is he to blame for his own actions, but anyone who told him to, or asked him to, or commanded him to, or paid him to, is also to blame. Now, I realize that's pretty dang obvious, and you might be wondering why the heck I'm bothering to explain it to you. Here's why. Have you ever asked government to do something to your neighbor that you wouldn't feel right doing to him on your own? If you ever voted, the answer is yes, you have. I don't care who you voted for, the answer is still yes. Because there's no such thing as a political party or a political candidate who doesn't use the law to boss your neighbor around in a way that you do not have the right to on your own. So when you voted for that, did you feel bad about it? If you voted for government to take some of your neighbor's stuff to give to the poor or to fund the military, if you voted to have armed enforcers telling your neighbor what he can eat or drink or smoke or whatever, if you voted for the force of law to be used against your neighbor when he never threatened or harmed you or anyone else, did you feel bad about it afterwards? I bet you didn't. But why not? I bet you'd feel bad about hiring some street thug to intimidate and threaten and rob and boss around your neighbor. So why, when it comes to government, do you do the same thing but you feel no guilt? Is it because there really is something fundamentally different about controlling your neighbor by way of government as opposed to a private thug? Or is it because you have been deceived into believing there's a difference when there isn't? Obviously, someone who votes for government to take money from his neighbor via property taxes to help pay for his own kids to go to school, for example, he perceives a dramatic, fundamental difference between doing that and just hiring a thief to go rob his neighbor. But is there actually a moral difference? Or is it just that the voter's perceptions and beliefs lead him to imagine a moral difference, when actually there is none? Let me be perfectly blunt about what I'm asking. If you vote for government to tax your neighbor for things that you want, but he doesn't, and all Democrats and all Republicans do this, I'm asking whether you are any better than the cowardly crook who hires some thug to rob his neighbor for him. Now, it's pretty understandable if you find that question somewhat unpleasant, maybe even insulting. Did this guy just ask me if I'm no better than a crook? Well, yeah, in one sense I did. But I'm also going to let you decide what the answer is. Now, I really, 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 really hope that if you find out, if it turns out that you've been tricked into doing something wrong, something that goes against your own values and your own moral code, that you'd want to know about it so that you could stop accidentally doing the wrong thing. Now, if you were to find out that you were deceived into doing something bad and all you want to do is make excuses and deny responsibility and then do the same thing again, then you might as well switch off this show. Because this show is for people who want to do the right thing, who want to be the good guy, and who would want to know if they're accidentally supporting something nasty and evil so they can stop doing it. I wish that described everyone, but it doesn't. I hope it describes you. Once again, I'm not here to try to convince you to throw away your values and your moral code so you can use mine instead. I'm just trying to help you see whether you might be inadvertently doing things that are contrary to your own values and your own moral code. After the break, we'll move past these hypotheticals and get into an example that is all too real. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rose. Before the break, I asked the slightly rude question, if you're a voter, are you any better than someone who hires a thug to go take his neighbor's stuff and boss him around? Now, I should clarify that intentions do matter. If you thought you were doing something legitimate and moral, that's a lot better than trying to do something nasty. By analogy, suppose your lawnmower was stolen and then you saw one exactly like it in your neighbor's garage. But it turned out he just bought the exact same model. If you hired someone to go take his, thinking it was actually yours, that's not nearly as bad as just sending over a thief because you want a free lawnmower. It's still theft, but you weren't trying to steal. You just didn't really understand what was going on. And that is really what I'm asking here. Could it be that your own misunderstanding of reality is leading you to do something that is morally equivalent to hiring a thief to rob your neighbor? Now, I'm sure you don't see it that way right now, and I'm not asking whether you tried to be a crook. I'm assuming you didn't. I'm asking whether you were deceived into accidentally advocating what amounts to robbery. Now, I said we'd get past the hypotheticals and get to something very real. And now we will. I personally spent a year in prison for misdemeanor willful failure to file, for not filing federal income tax returns. Now, as it happens, I didn't actually break the law, but that's a topic for another discussion. For this conversation, let's pretend that the law required me to file tax returns and to hand over a bunch of money, and because I didn't, I was thrown into prison for a year. There's actually a lot more to the story than that, but let's just stick to that for now. Did you vote for that to happen to me? Did you vote to put people into power who you know were going to demand that I and a couple 100 million other people give money to politicians or be put in a cage? If you voted Democrat or Republican, the answer is yes, you did. You voted for the people who put me in a cage for a year, knowing full well that if those people you voted for got into power, they would do this. They would demand money from lots of people and prosecute those who didn't hand it over. Now, I'm actually not bringing this up to whine at you or to try to make you feel bad. I'm bringing this up because it's a real-world example, very real, to me at least, of the actual results of voting and politics. And it makes a nice test case to examine the issue at hand. Whatever you want government to fund, whether it's the military, the police, social programs, education, whatever, you know what happens to those who don't pay up. Now, a lot of people, maybe including you, will be thinking, well, if you don't pay your fair share, you should get your house taken away, or you should be thrown in prison. You greedy criminal. Serves you right. And if you think that, keep listening anyway. Because obviously, whether it's okay to punish people who don't pay is directly linked to the question of whether it was okay to force them to pay in the first place. If in the end you decide you were completely in the right voting for people to demand money and hurt me if I didn't pay up, which I didn't and they did, then that'll be your decision. But let's see if logic and your own sense of right and wrong actually support such a conclusion. Whether you vote Democrat or Republican, you're voting for me to be taxed, to pay for something. If you're more liberal, you might be voting for people who would take money from me and give it to the poor. Now, personally, I think the welfare system, rather than being a noble way to help people who are down on their luck, instead pays people to be irresponsible and lazy. It fosters an entitlement mentality. It trains people to be dependent and basically creates a class of helpless, hopeless people. Okay, if you're more conservative, you might be voting for people who would take money from me to fund the police or the military. Now, personally, I think the military and the police threaten us far more often than they protect us. I believe that law enforcement, quote unquote, creates more crime than it prevents and oppresses more people than it defends. And that the military engages in warmongering on purpose to create constant conflict and bloodshed. Now, it's important to point this out. I really don't care if you agree with me on either of those. I'm not asking you to believe what I believe. But I do want to ask you this. Do you think it's okay for you to put people into power who you know are going to force me to fund things, whether it's the welfare state or the military or whatever, that I believe are horribly destructive to humanity? Again, you can insist that I'm wrong about that and that these are important, useful endeavors, but that's not the point. Even if you're right, do you consider it civilized and just and moral to forcibly rob me for whatever causes you think I should support? Or to ask government to forcibly rob me for whatever causes you want me to support? Let's say you live on the banks of a river that floods every few years, and a new neighbor moves in, and he decides to build a basement. Nobody else around there has a basement because they flood all the time. And this new neighbor decides not to buy flood insurance. And you inform him, first of all, your basement's going to flood constantly, and second of all, you really should have flood insurance. And so you tell him these things, and you're absolutely right on both points. The question is, do you have the right to hire someone to go force your neighbor to fill in his basement and force him to buy flood insurance? Granted, those are things he should have chosen on his own, and it was kind of stupid of him not to. That's not the question. The question is, do you have the right to send thugs to his house to force him to make whatever choices you think he should have made? Now, I doubt you do that in your day-to-day life, but you absolutely do that. You absolutely do the same thing by way of government if you still vote. And all of you Republican and Democrat voters out there, you constantly do this to each other. Both of you are trying to elect people who will try to force the other side to make choices they don't like, or fund things they're opposed to, or things they think are stupid. And while you're both doing that to each other, you're also both doing it to me. Now, incidentally, I don't do that to either of you. I don't want either of you, Republican, Democrat, whatever, I don't want you to be forced to fund anything that you're against. But then, I'm a bit radical. So, to be perfectly blunt, if you vote Democrat or Republican, you voted for the people and the system that put me in a cage for a year for not funding things that I believe to be harmful and destructive. So, thanks a lot for that. And I bet it never occurred to you that maybe you ought to feel guilty about that. Because you've always been taught that if you ask government to control your neighbor's choices and make him fund what you want, that's okay. That's legitimate. And that anyone who resists such attempts to control or extort them is a nasty criminal who deserves to be imprisoned. Well, that music means we're coming up on a break. But when we come back, I'm going to give a public confession and apology. Stay tuned, and we'll be back with Outside the Cage. Welcome back to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rhodes. Now, as promised before the break, it's time for me to make a public confession and apology. Now, this is about things I did many years ago, but I'm still pretty embarrassed and ashamed that I ever did such things. In short, I zealously advocated violence against innocent people. And it wasn't just one or two people, it was tens of millions of people who I didn't know anything about. By my words and my deeds, I gave support to a terrorist organization, a group of bullies with heavily armed thugs who would regularly intimidate and harass and extort and assault people in every state in this country and in many other countries. And I proudly displayed that gang's colors. And I routinely proclaimed my loyalty to that gang. And even though it sickens me now, I must admit that I felt a certain sense of joy when those who resisted the gang were destroyed, when they were robbed blind or kidnapped, put in prison, or even murdered. Now, if you're tempted to call the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security to report that I used to support this violent gang, that I used to give aid and comfort to this terrorist organization, don't bother. They already know all about it. Those in the federal government already know that I not only helped pay for the thuggery committed by this gang, but that I openly condoned the gang intimidating and robbing many millions of others to fund their reign of terror. So no, you don't need to inform the federal government that I was once a loyal supporter of a huge, vicious terrorist organization. They already know because they are it. They, the United States federal government, are the gang of bullies, thieves, and murderers that I supported. It was their acts of aggression against millions of innocents in this country and countless others that I was cheering for. It was their ongoing sadistic assaults against innocent people done in the name of national defense, or done in the name of the war on drugs, or done in the name of any other of their stupid ideas, that I supported with words and dollars. It was their mass kidnapping and enslavement scheme, known as the U.S. prison system, that I wholeheartedly condoned. It was their robbery through threats, intimidation, terrorization, harassment, direct theft, and even kidnapping and murder that I praised when it was done in the name of taxation. When their thugs were in Waco, torturing and terrorizing and murdering dozens of innocent, decent people, I sided with the aggressors, the bullies, the thugs, the FBI and the ATF. And I'm really dang ashamed to admit that now. When their mercenaries were in foreign countries, kicking in doors, pointing machine guns at innocent people, terrifying and attacking thousands upon thousands of people overseas, I proudly displayed their gang colors, red, white, and blue. Now, I can say, truthfully, that at the time I thought their thuggery was justified, that it was necessary. But I should have known better. I could say that, well, I was systematically brainwashed into being a supporter of their gang, and I was taught that supporting them was the patriotic, righteous thing to do, and that their violent aggression should be viewed as law and order. But I had a brain, and I had free will, and I could have actually thought about things. I should have doubted and reconsidered and acted like a responsible, thinking human being. But for a long, long time, I didn't. Instead, my mind made up these lame excuses for why it was good for me to support the gang called government, why the victims of the gang's violent aggression must have deserved it, why some greater good justified it, why it was necessary. It was all garbage. I supported evil, and then I parroted the rhetoric that was supposed to make it not seem evil. I was a patriotic, law-abiding taxpayer. I supported the troops, and I supported law enforcement. I had an FOP sticker and a Sheriff's Department sticker on my car. I even argued, and man, I hate admitting this, I even argued that the two worst individual acts of terrorism in the history of the world, the dropping of nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocents, were a great and noble event. I'm not kidding when I say I feel guilt and shame at ever having thought and said and done such things. I could say I didn't know any better and that everyone else around me was doing it too, but what kind of cop-out is that? How about the Nazis? How about what they did? Well, it's okay because they didn't know any better and everyone else was doing it. No. How about those who worked in the slave trade? They didn't know any better and everyone else was doing it. How about all of the heinous, unthinkable atrocities committed by state mercenaries, also known as soldiers, of just about every country in the world? Yes, including the U.S. Well, we gunned down hundreds of unarmed civilians, like at My Lai, but we didn't know any better and everyone else was doing it. That's not a good excuse. And it doesn't make it any better when you call the thuggery law and patriotism. I once openly and zealously supported the commission of violent aggression against millions of people in this country and elsewhere, and for that, I am ashamed. And for that, I sincerely apologize, even if the apology doesn't really do anything to ease the suffering of the victims of the violent organization I supported. Ironically, while I proudly supported the thuggery, I was rewarded and praised by almost everyone around me for my blind loyalty to the gang. And when I stopped supporting evil, then my fellow Americans put me in prison for it. And that's almost funny. When I finally did the right thing, I was punished for it. And maybe I had it coming. The brute thuggery I had condoned before, I got to feel some of it myself. A little poetic justice, perhaps. I got to be at the receiving end of the same terrorism, extortion, and kidnapping that I had so eagerly voted for years before. Do unto others. Yep, they did unto me. For years, I supported the statist extortion known as taxation, and I supported the kidnapping of resistors, known as imprisoning tax cheats. And years later, I got to see firsthand what it was I was actually advocating. Having formerly been a supporter of the war on drugs, for example, another fascist thuggery, I got to have the experience of having a dozen armed government thugs invading my home when the IRS came to try to shut me up. So maybe in one sense I deserved to be caged for a year, but not for disobeying the control freaks in government. If I deserved it, it was because I spent so many years obeying and supporting and praising the control freaks gang. A part of my repenting and atoning for past sins is to try to help other people not fall into the trap I fell into, to try to help others avoid being deceived into betraying their own consciences, to help them avoid being tricked into supporting, well, the destruction of humanity, to be blunt. Even in that, my past sins sometimes come back to haunt me. Every once in a while, when I'm trying to convince someone not to be duped into supporting evil by way of the rhetoric about government and authority and law and politics, I hear things coming from their mouths that are the exact same arguments and excuses I made myself years before. It's necessary. If we didn't have this forcible control and extortion of everyone, there would be chaos. And it's for your own good. And it's the law. You can't break the law. This is the system we have. If you don't like it, leave. This is the greatest country in the world. So I feel like the me of today is constantly arguing with the me of 20 years ago. And it can get pretty embarrassing because the me back then fell for some pretty ridiculous lies and had some pretty lame excuses for what he believed and what he did. Now I hope that by making my little confession today, I might help encourage others to re-examine what they're doing, what they're advocating. So maybe somebody else can say, yeah, I was wrong, and then maybe I have to change the way I see things and change what I can do. After this upcoming break, we're going to do a very simple exercise having to do with bluntly stating the truth. And in some cases, it's surprisingly difficult and uncomfortable. Stay tuned and you'll see why. Welcome back to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rhodes. Political rhetoric almost always consists of 100% spin and propaganda and 0% actual truth. With maybe one exception, politicians don't say what they mean. If they did, no one would vote for them. In fact, everyone would avoid them like the plague because they'd be recognized as narcissistic, power-happy control freaks. So they bury the substance of their agenda under layers and layers of euphemisms, distractions, emotionalism, propaganda, and bald-faced lies. In short, when it comes to anything political, the only discussion you'll hear in the mainstream news, or from any politician of any political party, is basically a giant pile of horse poo, very nicely decorated and covered up with beautiful icing. Sorry for this slightly rude analogy, but let me give you an example of what I mean. You might hear a politician saying something like, by working together with all of us contributing our fair share, we can make this nation great. Well, it sounds good. Sounds like it's about togetherness and cooperation and being productive and all that good stuff. Trouble is, none of that has anything to do with what the politician is actually talking about. He's talking in a completely disingenuous way about his political agenda. Now, I have to point out something here that's actually pretty obvious, but it hardly ever gets mentioned about political agendas and government. What does government do? It issues and enforces laws. That's it. It tells you what to do, and it punishes you if you disobey. The end. That's politics. That's all politics is. It's all it can ever be. Now, no politician's going to describe it that way, nor does anyone in the mainstream media. And most people have never thought about it that way. But it takes about 1 minute to prove that this is the case. All legislation, no matter how flowery the wording, no matter how it's pitched, no matter how complicated the terminology, constitutes a command backed by a threat. Every so-called tax is give us money or we'll hurt you. Every legal prohibition is do this or we'll hurt you. Don't do this or we'll hurt you. Every legal requirement is do this or we'll hurt you. That's all the law is and all it can ever be. The commands can get insanely complicated. Obey these 10,000 pages of regulations or we'll hurt you. But the template is always the same. Obey or we hurt you. If you doubt this, try writing a law yourself. Try making one up yourself that isn't a command backed by a threat. What would it even look like? Section 1, come on guys, be nice to each other. That's not what the law is. Now, occasionally commands and threats are justified. If some guy breaks into your house at night, you might say, get out or I'll shoot you. A command and a threat. And if you ask me, you'd be perfectly justified in doing so. Most of the time, however, bossing people around and threatening them is not a nice thing to do. When it is justified, people don't bother hiding it under euphemisms and pleasantries. To the guy breaking into your house, you might yell, get out or I'll kill you. But you probably won't say, We're only asking that each of us do the right thing by moving to the appropriate premises, and to that end, a program of mandatory relocation may be implemented by way of various incentives. But that is how almost all political agendas are twisted and mangled and misrepresented. They're commands and threats, and they hide it under this flowery garbage. So here's what I want you to do. Consider a few different government programs, and for each one that you support, instead of giving the prettied up propaganda version, I want you to bluntly state the literal reality of what that quote-unquote public policy actually means, what it actually entails. For example, when speaking of taxation, the politicians will say, all of us are asked to contribute our fair share to cover the costs of the nation. Sounds sort of nice, except that, one, no one is being asked anything. They're being told, you'll do this or we hurt you. Two, they aren't contributions. You don't have a choice. It's a command. It's not charity. Three, fairness doesn't have anything to do with it. And four, the money doesn't go to the nation. In other words, the politician version is a complete lie from beginning to end. When translated into reality, the message sounds more like this. We, the politicians, demand money from you, and our enforcers will hurt you if you don't pay up. Then we will decide how to spend the money we took from you. That's the actual truth. Now, you might not like to hear it described that way, but you know that every bit of that is absolutely accurate. That's what really happens. So that's all I'm asking now. Let's run down a list of political programs, and for the ones you support, see if you can bluntly state the reality of what you advocate. If you like the war on drugs, then say, if anyone gets caught possessing a mind-altering substance not approved by the politicians, because this doesn't include beer, I want armed people to invade that person's home, forcibly capture him, and take him away from his friends and family and put him in a cage for a few years. Now, if you can say that and still support it, we'll address that later. Right now, I just want to see how comfortable you are when you bluntly describe the political agenda you support. Here's another example. If you support government welfare, say this. I want millions of people forced to hand over money they have earned under the threat of being imprisoned if they don't, so some of it can be given to the needy. Actually, let's make this more personal and less abstract. If you support government welfare, say this to me. Larken, I think that you should be forced, by way of the threat of being caged, to hand over a cut of what you earn to the politicians so they can give some of it to the poor. Now, oddly, though tens of millions of people advocate exactly that by how they vote, I've never met anyone who can comfortably and happily say that to my face. Why not? Another example, if you're for gun control, say, Larken, I want the politicians to tell you that you can't have a gun, and that if you get caught with one, I want you to be taken captive, dragged away from your family, and caged for a few years. And in case you think I'm scary or dangerous or something, let's change the target of the message. So once again, gun control advocates, say this. Hey, little old lady who lives in a bad part of town and who keeps an old revolver for protection, I want you to be taken hostage at gunpoint and put in a cage. Are there any gun control proponents out there who feel comfortable in saying that? Because that is the literal reality of what quote-unquote gun control is. Ironically, it's pretty easy to prove that gun control is gun violence, because it is enforced by quote-unquote law enforcers with guns, and they use those guns to threaten people and arrest people and cage people who get caught having quote-unquote illegal weapons. So if you're for gun control, you are for gun violence, because they're the same thing. Anyway, the list of things I could cover goes on and on and on. And I dare you to do a little exercise. Make a list of the political programs you support, and then write down, literally describe the command and the threat involved with each one. because that's all laws are. Put it simply and literally, and see if your own conscience and your own moral code makes you cringe at what you've written. Now, we're just about out of time for tonight, but I want to close by bluntly describing my political position, or rather my anti-political position, describing what I advocate in simple, literal terms. If you try to attack or rob or defraud anyone, then I support the use of whatever level of violence it takes to stop you from harming others. Other than that, I don't want any force to be used against you. Not by me, not by my neighbors, not by people in other countries, not by those calling themselves government, not by the people who wear the label law enforcement, not by anyone. If you're not trying to rob or hurt anyone else, I want you to be totally and completely free, even if I don't like what you do with that freedom, even if I don't approve of your choices or your behavior. Now, what I ask after saying that is, will you do the same for me? Your choices are, no, I won't. I'm not going to let you be free, Larken. I'm going to boss you around and force you to pay for things I want and you don't. Or you can say yes, but if you say yes, understand what that entails. No more voting. No more politics. No more asking government to do anything that you don't have the right to do. Can you do that? Or would you rather portray your own moral code? Heck with that. I like using government to control people. Choice is yours. Now, we're just about out of time. I command you to go buy and read my new book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, or I will hurt you. Okay, just kidding, I won't really. But I would urge you to voluntarily get the book, which you can get at Amazon.com, to see if you have been duped into cheering for the bad guys for most of your life. Until next time, this is Larken Rose, inviting you to live life outside the cage.